this afternoon. And hello to all of our Oklahoma friends too, our new friend. Let's see.
Thanks, Rabbi Weiss. My name is Liz Ravitch, and I'm the co-president of Congregation Bethel in Yardley, Pennsylvania. I'm so excited to kick off the inaugural session of the new exciting series called The Wandering Jews. Today, as you know, we're in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Over the next 2 weeks, we're also going to visit Abuja, Nigeria, and Stockholm, Sweden. Then the series ends in May, right back here in Yardley, Pennsylvania. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the Jewish communities from all around the world, and I'm so happy that technology allows us all to be together like this. So now I turn the emceeing over to Rabbi Jacobson.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Rabbi Weiss, for trusting us as your inaugural congregation. We are so happy to be here. I am Rabbi Abby Jacobson from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I've been here for coming up on 12 years, although I was raised on a cattle ranch in Central Florida. When people say then, oh, Oklahoma must be like home, I will tell you that Oklahoma City is a lot bigger and more thriving than where I came from. So we're delighted to be able to partner on this. I think we're doing a really interesting topic today, Rabbi Weiss. Who is introducing whose community first?
Yeah, so we'll just give like a roadmap of what we're doing this afternoon. So we're going to start with a little bit of sharing about our two communities. We obviously are in very different communities, both geographically and just culturally. And we wanted to celebrate that and explore each other's communities. You know, obviously, right now we can't hop on a plane as easily, although more people are doing that. And we're taking advantage of this virtual format to be able to learn about each other's communities. And then, so we'll do a little bit of sharing first. And each of us has chosen a representative of our community to kind of walk us through some questions like about our communities, do a little virtual tour. And then Rabbi Jacobson and I are going to engage in this topic about Israel and democracy and monarchy, and maybe messianism too, in kind of dialogue with a few texts we've looked at and kind of open it up for conversation following that part. So we're going to start with just the communal sharing about what are our communities like. So take a virtual, you can strap in virtually and get ready to see some Oklahoma City and some Yardley, Pennsylvania. I know that on the Oklahoma side, we have Jeff Goss, who is their youth director and is actually from the area. And on the Yardley side, we have Carol Weissman, who has long roots here and a wonderful active member of our community. So let's see here. Dealer's choice. Would you guys like to go first or second?
I think we'd really like to learn about Yardley, Pennsylvania.
All right, so I'm gonna spotlight Kara, who's amazing, and we will hear from her first.
So I grew up in the area. I grew up in a neighboring town to Yardley, but it was very different than it is now. We also moved away for 20 years and then came back about 10 years ago and also lived in Houston, Texas and in Raleigh, North Carolina. So a little bit of where I come from, and I was talking to my husband about it, is also comparing Yardley and Bucks County to these other areas. And so it might not be a fair comparison because I am comparing to different areas more than just what we have to offer. We were talking actually on our way down to Philadelphia to see our daughter. And I think that what's very different to us about this area is in our area, there's not a centralized Jewish location. In Houston, within 5 miles of the very large JCC, and because probably similar to Oklahoma City is there's not as many Jews, it's a tighter knit community. Here, I find that the community is really through the synagogue, as opposed to the community at large. We don't have a JCC, and a lot of the Jews on the other side of Philadelphia, I think they more are tied to the area, where I think in our area, we're more tied toward a synagogue, at least from my opinion. I think we're tied more to a synagogue than to a more of a geographic location. Philadelphia, which is only about 35 minutes away, does have a wonderful Jewish museum. But I think in sort of tying into what I just said, I think that they overestimated the desire for people to go. And therefore financially, they're not in such wonderful shape. So I think this area has a lot to offer. I just think it's easy to be Jewish up here. My guess is it's not as easy in Oklahoma City, just like it wasn't as easy to just blend in Houston. I think that's a big difference in our community, that I think we're more synagogue centric than community itself. That's sort of where I'm going with that. I don't know what else. I think it depends what area you are geographically compared to Philadelphia. I don't know if we're very different. I think you're probably, again, a little different than us because of the area you're in.
Great. And you want to add anything about like kind of hidden gems of our area, like special areas of interest in Yardley for Jewish, like beyond
Good
our
question. I think our synagogue, just biased. I think we have a beautiful synagogue. As I said, I grew up here, so the synagogue used to be in a different area of Bucks County, but the Jews were moving out of that area, and about, I'd say 15 minutes away. So not very far away, but in ways very far away, very different climate. I think our synagogue to me is definitely a gem. We have gorgeous stained glass windows, and on the pride side of it in our chapel, my mother did 2 huge stained glass windows that are there, which is my hidden gem, just myself. I also think just if you want to be involved, I think you can be. I just, again, think it's very much related to a synagogue versus a community. I also think, again, not so far away, and hopefully anybody that's in this area that hasn't gone, we are members of the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia, and it's not at all a Holocaust museum like many cities have and Houston had. It's very much about Jewish life in this area. So if you guys ever come to this area, that would be one thing that I would definitely say. We also do have a day school that I don't know a whole lot about it because my kids really grew up in Houston. My daughter went for 2 months to preschool and then we moved. So I don't know a whole lot about that. We don't, in Northeast Philadelphia, I'd say we have some kosher restaurants, but not a lot around here. So that's yeah, a little different. What else did you want me to discuss? Or
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. What do you think is one of the first things that people would notice if they were coming from out of town about our Jewish community?
I think there's a number of synagogues. I was just talking with somebody yesterday for the first time. We were actually we were outside and then actually went inside somebody's house when it got cold. And we're talking, I think it's just, there's a lot of different, whether it be conservative, reform, Orthodox. There's a lot of places to check out around here. There's not, unfortunately, I think I wish there was more crossover between the synagogues and the various areas. I don't think there's as much as there could be. And I know that the Jewish community here, the Kehillah, is working on that. And I think that brings it together in a much more special community. It's also a beautiful area. So in ways, very spiritual that way, to go on hikes and areas. I think it doesn't just have to be at the synagogue to have a spiritual experience.
Indeed. Yeah, it's a beautiful area. Thank you so much, Kara. That was
Sure.
and a virtual jazz hands for Yeshikochech. Beautiful, beautiful summary of our community. And when it's safe to travel again all over, we want to invite you to come check out our beautiful synagogue, which does, as Kara mentioned, include her mom's gorgeous stained glass windows in the chapel. And she has deep roots here and does amazing work. And just want to acknowledge Kara as one of our amazing congregant leaders and folks who make our place so special. I want to now kind of pivot to Oklahoma. And I also just want to acknowledge, first of all, how thrilled and honored I am to be joined by Rabbi Abby Jacobson, who, along with her spouse, who's also a rabbi, Rabbi Juan Mejia, always to me were kind of the model rabbinic couple. As many of you know, I'm also part of a rabbinic couple, and they've done incredible groundbreaking work, really as pioneers in their region, and really very much role models in many, many ways. And I also want to just highlight the fact that Oklahoma and Oklahoma City were in the same boat. A few months ago, we were talking about that horrible, devastating winter storm in Texas. Oklahoma was also very much affected. So I don't know if that will come up in the conversation, but just wanted to make everyone aware that although it wasn't as much in the news, Oklahoma was very much affected as well. And so we're very honored to be joined by Emmanuel Synagogue. And we're going to hear now from Jeff Goss, who serves the community there as well and grew up from there. So with no further ado, Baruch haba, Jeff.
Hi, Rabbi. Thanks, and Kara, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to everything you had to say. I love the Philadelphia area. My family is originally from the New Jersey area. My brother went to school at Penn, so very familiar, and so amazing. A little bit about Oklahoma. As Rabbi Jacobson said, I did grow up here, and so I went away, been back, but overall, roughly about 40 years in the area. First, let me talk about the synagogue. The synagogue's about 115 years old. It started off as a more traditional synagogue, moved from the downtown area, moved to where everybody was kind of moving north in the community, ended up being where it is currently around the 1950s. Have about 180 family members in the area. There are two what we would consider other congregations in the area, Reform congregation and Chabad, although Hillel does serve a little bit more beyond the college community a lot of times, which isn't too far away at the University of Oklahoma. We have a wonderful federation. We tend to work with a lot of our cohorts in various programs, whether educational, and for roughly 35 years. We shared Sunday schools together with the Reform community. At times we have shared youth group together. So it's definitely been interesting. In the 1970s, kind of an interesting side note, if you go around and look at like universities that have very large Jewish populations these days, you'll see that University of Texas is amongst the highest. But at one time, University of Oklahoma was significantly higher than that of University of Texas. And most kids who lived in Houston or Dallas would end up at Oklahoma. And thus, in the 70s, we had a pretty substantial growth in the Jewish community here. A lot of those people were like me, grew up here, and then ended up leaving and going somewhere else for college and a lot of other things. However, I did end up coming back. Like I said, we have about 180 congregants. It's a conservative congregation, kind of going to Kara, since she expressed a little bit about the Southwest, which is excellent because I do know the Southwest really well, travel to a lot of those congregations. We're a very open congregation, not only like, take COVID out of the mixture. You walk in our doors, you don't see the security that you might see in Dallas or definitely Austin. In order to get on the Austin campus, where there's 7 or 8 congregations, you got to go through all sorts of security to get onto that campus. Some congregations are still like that in the Dallas or Houston area, but it's very user-friendly beyond that. Just like you walk in and everybody seems to have a sense of ownership. And that's the one thing that I notice when I travel around to a lot of other congregations. yes, a lot of people think they're in charge. At our congregation, everybody thinks they're in charge. And for the most part, they are. They have found some sort of niche if they want to be involved, and they kind of make it theirs. And I love that about it. It also makes it very challenging at times as the youth director, and I'm sure Abby would agree, because it's like you got 20 people going in 20 different directions. But it is amazing to have that kind of energy at times. Other thing, there's about 5,500 Jews total in Oklahoma. So our next major closest community is 90 miles away, and that would be Tulsa. And there's 3 congregations there as well. Also, the closest kosher restaurant would be in Dallas. So roughly 3.5 hours away, depending on how fast you drive. Other interesting facts about Oklahoma and the Jewish community, besides being over time being significantly funded through oil, as you might imagine, I think one of our more interesting facts is that the grocery cart was invented here by a guy named Cy Goldman. And that company has been since been taken over by one of our congregants, so to speak, kind of the offshoot. But if you're old enough, you might remember a grocery chain known as Humpty Dumpty. They were the first grocery chain that bought grocery carts, and then it kind of spread from this part of the country up through the Northeast, and guy became one of the first billionaires in the United States, pretty much over grocery carts. So very cool, very nice guy. Other things, the zoo, amazing, really good zoo. I love going to zoos anywhere. Would have been the first place I'd take any of my kids when I traveled to any of the Jewish communities. So it's always got to stack up to the Oklahoma City Zoo. And other than that, I think that's about it. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. So I guess we should open it up for questions. That would be great. Anyone have any questions either for Jeff or for Kara about our 2 communities? Yeah, Ruth, let's see.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for allowing us to join you. My husband and I, with some friends, visited Oklahoma City a few years ago, and we went to the, I guess it was the Federal Building bombing memorial there. And I was wondering, and they did a beautiful job with it. I will say it was very moving. Was the Jewish community impacted at that attack time?
No one from our community died in the Murrow bombing. I can tell you there were a number of medical people that volunteered, also some people from the FBI and ATF from our community. I personally volunteered. I was one of the first volunteers down, was then deployed as part of a medic team to go into the building. So an very interesting side note that most people don't know, and since you've been down there, it will certainly mean something to you. So when we were there the first several nights, it was drizzling. It never stopped drizzling for the first 3 nights. And so the water was cascading constantly off the building. And so that sound that you hear around that reflective pool very much sounds like every night how we would spend out there. All you could hear, because everybody was so quiet, it was so reverent. You didn't have a lot of investigators going on. So it was just at that point kind of still search and rescue. So it was very quiet, and all you could hear was that water. So I thought they did an amazing job with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
See, Steve, yeah.
Yeah. Jeff, is there a lot of cooperation between the Jewish community and non-Jewish community in Oklahoma in terms of combating anti-Semitism and racism? And
So
what is the cooperation between the Christian community and the Jewish community?
in many ways, the rabbi would be better, because she was president of our interfaith group here, one of the interfaith groups here, but overall, I will tell you, as a parent of 3 kids that have gone through the school and we have faced issues, oftentimes we have been able to turn to other members of the community, other organizations, including like the YMCA, which like rallied all their troops to get behind when we had a significant issue with my son when he was, I think, in 4th grade. So overall, I find it, you know, even though we do have anti-Semitism here, and it can be really, really bad at times, I really find being able to turn to my friends, and whether Muslim, Christian, whatever, real strong, real strong, good allies.
Great.
Any other questions for either Jeff or Kara? Let's see, anybody else? Yeah, Carol.
No, sorry.
No, that's Carol, not the Kara.
Yeah. Jeff, a quick question. If you wanted to get kosher meat in Oklahoma City, where would you go?
All right, so in the last couple of years, we've been, for lack of a better way to put it, blessed with Whole Foods. So they've come in and every year, so I guess this year was our 8th or 9th year that we've run this Burgers Bar. So if you've been to Israel, like the burger place to go that's very Americanized is Burgers Bar. So we run this Burgers Bar in the Sukkah. And when they came in, they donated like the first 10 pounds the first year. Like I asked them for 30 pounds. They're like, well, all we got is 10 right now, but we'll order you the other 20, take the 10, and we'll get you the rest. And ever since then, they're an awesome partner. But prior to that, I honestly had to drive down to a place called Tom Thumb down in Dallas. And they would always work out various deals with me and stuff like that. But that used to be the bane of doing that program.
Thank you
So much. Maybe one final question if anyone has, and then we'll kind of turn over to the next part of the program. Let's see, anyone else?
It's a bit off topic, but since you said you like to take your kids to all the zoos, Jeff, I assume you've been privy to the Jewish community in St. Louis. So how does the St. Louis Zoo match up against Okc Zoo?
Good question. I personally, it's certainly hometown bias, but I remember going up to St. Louis Zoo starting when I was about 7, before I'd head for Camp Sabra, so out in the Lake of the Ozarks. But Oklahoma City Zoo is definitely a step up from the St. Louis Zoo. I of all the zoos I've been to, which is probably numbering around 25, 30, I'd say it's definitely top 5.
That's impressive. The Philly Zoo, as a plug for the Philly Zoo, I think is the first, you can correct me if I'm mistaken, the first zoological garden in the US, I believe.
I think you're right.
Historic interest there. It's a nice one. And our community is about a 40-ish minute drive from like Center City, Philly. So not too far. We're kind of considered an outer suburb of Philadelphia. So a lot of great points of interest within the city proper, which is a whole different Jewish constellation. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Kara and Jeff, for sharing about the communities. Do a kind of yesher koach hands to both. Here we go. That's my. And now we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that Rabbi Jacobson and I had kind of brainstormed. We were thinking about something that would tie into the Jewish calendar. And of course, we just celebrated Israel's 73rd birthday. So happy birthday, Israel. And we were thinking about a topic that would be of mutual interest to our communities. So we named our session a bit of a sexy name of Game of Thrones of democracy and democracy and monarchy and the state of Israel. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Rabbi Jacobson, would you like to start us off, or shall I start us off?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. Thank you.
Great. Let me highlight you so that we can see your beautiful sanctuary.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. So we oh, excuse me. One of the tremendous things about over the years, as we have been in a place where there has been democracy, we've been champing at the bit to participate in it. And that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. And in the modern times, especially with the Ashkenazi community, it's not until Napoleon Bonaparte emancipates Jews following his big 1799 decision to reinstate Jews into, like, as one of the recognized religions of the state. Napoleon said, if it makes you a better Frenchman, then it must be good. So the Catholic Church convinced him that Catholicism made them better Frenchmen, and he said, well, cool, come on back, church. And then rabbis jumped in and did the same thing and convinced Napoleon that Jews are better Frenchmen if they get to be Jews. So that brought Jews a lot of rights, including in France the right to vote, which was not something that had been common in the post-Middle Ages Ashkenazi experience. People were pretty sold on the idea in a lot of cases, especially in European Jewry, that democracy was a great idea. Israel is formed, when it's officially reestablished in 1948 as a modern state, it's formed as a parliamentary democracy. Ironically, mostly by people who only know of democracy by rough description. If you think about the Jews who were already living in the land of Israel, they'd been under the Ottoman Empire, which was not a democracy. Jews who came from Eastern Europe, Russia, just after the foundation of the state from North Africa, these are people who did not get the benefits of living in a democracy themselves, who nevertheless went out to create a democracy. And then if we look at what our tradition expects us to be hoping for, Messiah. We want Messiah. Eventually, that we're told that the Messiah is supposed to be the next king of Israel. And I hate saying it in English because we share English with Protestantism, and so everything I say sounds a little bit Goyish, a little bit not exactly Jewish because of trying to say it in English. That we're looking for a king, lowercase k, to reestablish the Davidic monarchy, so that God established King David as the rightful king of Israel and his heirs after him. And when Mashiach comes and we get the monarchy back, what we're getting back is the same biblical monarchy that was existing under King Saul, King David, King Solomon. So if democracy has been something that Jews have longed for and have wanted to participate in so badly, and if Mashiach is supposed to be devoutly to be hoped for, if we are waiting around for the Messiah to come and usher in a new era of our religious history, but the Messiah is supposed to be a monarch, is there a tension between our love of democracy and voting for stuff and our love of the idea of the biblical monarchy? So that was our starting point. Rabbi Weiss?
Sure. Yes, now I'm unmuted. I will, let's see, add my spotlight. Here we go. Thank you so much, Rabbi Jacobson, for that excellent introduction and kind of overview of the problem, the kind of the tension that we were exploring in thinking about this question, which is a really urgent question for many people theologically, spiritually, and practically. We're right now we're in a time in the whole world, not just among the Jewish people, we're really asking some deep questions about what is the ideal way for government. In other words, is the way we've grown accustomed to how governments function in the United States and elsewhere, is there kind of a shift happening right now? Are people desiring something else? Historically, as Rabbi Jacobson pointed out, Jews really did not have a taste for democracy until it was, with the emancipation, introduced to them as this new, exotic, exciting opportunity to be considered a citizen. Interestingly enough, there's a kind of tension even within the Jewish community, because at least in the Eastern European context, the shtetl was very much an oligarchical model. There were a lot of class stratifications that happened, and people were very attached to those different hierarchies. And that's on one hand. On the other hand, in that same area in kind of Eastern Europe for about 200 years, you have what's called the Vad Arbat Ha'aratzot, the Council of the Four Lands, which actually more or less was a democratic model, where you had representatives from 70 different communities, Jewish communities, that were basically elected and would make decisions together as a collective for this umbrella group of Jews. So you see different models emerging as an echo of what's going on in the secular world. And you see this, and those who took my synagogue class know that we were talking about this in the context of the American synagogue, that actually even American synagogues began to change their internal governance according to the wave of democracy that spread throughout the United States. In other words, as the Constitution came into effect, synagogues were encouraged to create their own constitutions in that same model. So you see it even on a local level, and you might even see it today in your own governance in different synagogues. So that's an interesting piece that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about a little bit. There's a famous rabbinic teaching that many of you will be familiar with regarding the Messiah, right? The rabbis say when if you're planting a tree and someone comes along and says, the Messiah is coming, keep planting, right? There's a certain pragmatic element of Judaism, like, let's see a project through to its completion. And so historically, biblically, philosophically, we've tended to be on the more of this earth end of the spectrum, traditionally. I say that though with some qualification, because of course we have all these different moments in history, especially around kind of millennial fervor, like the Shabtai Tzvi movement, all these times when Jews found themselves feeling threatened and desperate for a singular savior who might be some kind of messianic figure. So like the case of Shabtai Tzvi is probably one of the more famous examples of that, a character who ended up not being a messiah, but ultimately apostatized to Islam. Or as a friend of mine once joked, when I said he was a false messiah, that's what you think. But as far as I know, he is a false messiah. We have this in our own times more recently with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Those of you who are familiar with Chabad, right? There are proponents to this day within Chabad who believe that the seventh Rabbi, Rabbi Schneerson of blessed memory, is going to come back as the Messiah. So you have these camps embedded in our people. The question, as Rabbi Jacobson points out with Israel, becomes all the more interesting because, of course, we are so privileged to have a Jewish state. It's a modern Jewish state, informed by modern ideals and Jewish ideals. And sometimes those two forces make interesting bedfellows. How do you reconcile between a kind of traditional investment in some kind of redemptive messianic figure and the very much of this earth element of we have to make decisions? We have to make decisions as a democratic state. I wanted to share one perspective that you probably have heard of this character, but kind of like talking about what's really behind his thinking. And I'll share it by way of a personal anecdote, sorry. So this is over 20 years ago. A news story you might have encountered in the papers, on the news, which is I grew up in Chicago and went to Jewish school through high school, Jewish religious high school with a very Zionist bend. And we started having some interesting visitors come to our campus, not invited. They would come kind of of their own volition from the Jewish Defamation League. After a certain event happened in the news. So, not the Jewish Defense League. I was confusing with the ADL. It's the JDL, which is very different than the ADL. Okay, sorry. I'm post my second vaccine, so I'm still a little foggy. So, around 1999 or 2000, there was a white supremacist who went through our area on a shooting rampage. trying to kill every minority population he could find. And he targeted specifically known minority areas, including ours, which was a very Jewish area. And our high school was very much known to be the Jewish high school. And it was on a Friday night, he drove through the neighborhood around my high school, and he actually shot one of my friends. He shot him in the leg, my friend Ephraim, and it was like this close away to one of his arteries on his leg, and it would have killed him if it were like a millimeter closer. And so to this day, my friend Ephraim has this bullet lodged in his leg. And unfortunately, many of the people he attacked, he killed. Ricky Birdsong was a African-American basketball coach in Northwestern. He killed him also closer to where I live. Anyway, so in the aftermath of this horrific massacre, there were a number of folks from JDL who came to our high school, would circle the building with pamphlets. Pamphlets quoting Rabbi Meir Kahane, with whom I'm sure many of you are familiar, a very prominent and outspoken 20th century political figure in Israel. And it introduced all of us to his philosophy and to his position. This was never taught in our high school officially, but we all became very interested because we could tell there was a lot of controversy. People were very upset that these people were coming around our high school because what they advocated were things like self-arming, learning self-defense, but not just self-defense, but actually arming and forming very specific kind of political ideologies. So for those who aren't as familiar with Rabbi Meir Kahane, he was a prominent figure originally from the United States, and he was a rabbi who actually served in Knesset. He moved to Israel, and he founded a political group called Okc, and he was extremely charismatic. And before our own times, our own culture of very extreme kind of cancel culture and very bold rhetoric, he was very much a man of bold rhetoric. He would decry and denounce differing opinions as being non-Jewish when he didn't agree with them. But I don't want to get into the specific rhetorical flavor of what he says, but I want to talk instead about some of the questions he raises, which cut to the concern that Rabbi Jacobson and I were talking about this essential tension between what it means to be a democratic state and a state that aspires towards messianism. When it comes to Rabbi Meir Kahane, he came very solidly and unequivocally down on the side of the monarchy. He unabashedly said, we need to aspire to a Torah true Israel that won't water itself down, in his words, to a secular government, that it really, everyone representing Israel should be religious and should aspire to this model of absolute Torah-driven, eventually, monarchy. Now, he said, of course, we can't have a monarchy now because there's no prophet, as the Torah says, to appoint the monarch. So instead, he advocated for a system which was more like what we had in the rabbinic era, even in the second of appointing a nasi, who was like a regent who would act like a king. Now, there are a number of issues that come up with his positions. His most famous work is called Or HaRayon, which is a book that we, out of curiosity as high school students, started reading because we could tell a lot of our parents had some serious questions about these JDL folks. And it generated a lot of conversation, I remember, about what this means. And interestingly, many of my friends, this was a very formative experience for us when our friend was shot, obviously, ended up moving to Israel. And some of them became sympathetic to his positions because they felt like, really, we are under attack and we need to have an Israel that represents this particular religious view. Now, Rabbi Meir Kahane was very much steeped in the writings of Maimonides, who really advocated also for a monarchy system. And this was very influential in the way that he wrote. It's interesting, though, because when you look at the Torah and the original sources about monarchy, the Torah technically commands us to have a king. However, and this is a big however, the Torah places, of course, all sorts of limitations on that king, such that the typical privileges and benefits of the king really become a little less sexy than they are to other monarchs. The other thing is that in the book of Samuel, the people clamor for a king, and the prophet Samuel is very disappointed them and expresses that disappointment, saying, why do we have to be like all the other nations? So, and we see even more of a compelling counter case, I would say, is that we see both during the periods of the temple and also in the Second Commonwealth, so many examples of kings really going against what Meir Kahane would say is Torah true law. The kings really become corrupt. And we see certain rabbis come out foursquare against monarchy, including 15th century scholar and also a major statesman himself, Rabbi Don Abarbanel, who actually served the high courts in absolutist Spain and Portugal. And he says, of course, absolute monarchy is going to corrupt absolutely. We see so many examples of this. In his own Venetian, he eventually served in the Venetian government, and he saw that as actually very inspiring as a model to which we can aspire today. So I wanted to just kind of introduce a little bit some of what Rabbi Meir Kahane has to say. And again, he was lauded as a major figure for good reason. He was a tremendous scholar, and he attracted a lot of attention and interest that to this day is an active conversation. He was assassinated in 1990 by an Egyptian when he was giving a talk in Manhattan, but he still very much has a strong following. I also wanted to share, and then I want to turn it back over to Rabbi Jacobson and then give it open for some discussion, a position by somebody who overlapped with him a little bit. He's a little older. Or no, sorry, he didn't overlap. A character who kind of precedes him by a century. There's a rabbi who was born in pre-state Israel, whose writings have recently been unearthed, which is exciting. They're beginning to be translated into English. And he wrote a little bit in English because he actually lived most of his life, his adult life, in Hoboken, New Jersey. Rabbi Chaim Hirschenhorn overlapped exactly in years with Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, Abraham Yitzchak Kook, who was, of course, the first chief rabbi of Israel, Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel. And so Rabbi Hirschenhorn was born in Israel and was a very progressive educator. So progressive that his ways brought him to the United States, where there was more resonance with the kind of pedagogy he looked for. But his whole project was kind of very different than Rabbi Kahane's in the sense that he took his passion for Torah and dedicated his life to seeing ways to respond to the urgent questions of the day through a lens of Torah. In other words, he took very seriously the young people's burning questions and the secular people he encountered. And he said, these are important people, these are important allies, and we have to engage them in a conversation about what a love of Torah could look like in engaging these questions. He talked in ways way beyond his years. He died in 1935, way beyond his years about women's equality. He talked about the urgency of democracy. This is all before the establishing of the modern state of Israel. His parents were part of the Chibat Zion movement, and they came out of Pink's Ukraine. And they came with these ideals, and he carried them and he wrote about them. And so I wanted to share some really beautiful thoughts that he had. He was part of a very influential gathering in Pittsburgh. It was the 21st Zionist Conference, and they outlined a plan for the establishment of the state of Israel on the basis of justice and equality. Rabbi Hirschenhorn was at that meeting and was very moved by what he saw as a kind of prophetic call for justice and equality and freedom in the American model. He loved American democracy. And again, he eventually moved to Hoboken and was writing and advocating for American Zionism his whole life. And his response to this idea of clamoring for a king is, we live in a time when that's an obsolete model. When we talk about kingship in the Torah, we're often talking about, he says, I'll read you a quote of his, there's a definite relation between the commandment of appointing a king and the eradication of the evil nation Amalek and the building of the temple for sacrificial offerings. The king was needed to accomplish the destruction of Amalek. After completing his task, his next duty was to build the temple for sacrifices. Moreover, the king had to be appointed only through a prophet. In these days of democracy, when kings are toppling from their thrones and monarchy rightly seems to be doomed, when war is being waged against autocratic powers to make the world safe for democracy, how is it possible for us to consider the setting up of a hereditary king to reign over us in Palestine as Jewish tradition demands. So he's asking this exact question that we're talking about. And he is a tremendous proponent of liberal democracy before it was even cool. And he very much says, instead of thinking about it as a strictly religious model, he thinks of it in terms of Jewish nationalism, and he's in very good company. And when you read the writings of Avraham Yitzhak Kook, you can see between these exact peers a very similar kind of language and aspiration to really work together through this model. Because I'll close with this thought. One of Kahana's concerns about democracy, he didn't want a government that would speak in the people's name, because he was afraid that the people would then be afraid to resist it, especially if it violated what he considered Torah law. But in the space of a constitutional democracy, you can implement laws, if people so choose, that won't violate Torah law. And this, of course, is an ongoing conversation in Knesset all the time. For any of us following the debates in the Knesset, right? Do we open shops on Shabbat? Can we run these kinds of ads? What actually is in accord with Torah values? This is an open debate. And there are many folks in Knesset who are quite religious. So again, we are such a diverse people. And thankfully, the state of Israel includes that diversity and even reflects it to some extent in its parliament, in its Knesset. And so this is really a question we grapple with, not only as Zionists, not only as Jews, as humans. How do we take certain ultimate morals and values and harmonize them with our desire to harmonize, with our desire to be among other voices and live in a free and equal democracy? So with that, I'm going to turn back to Rabbi Jacobson. Here we go.
Thank you, Rabbi Weiss. Thank you for the way you laid that out. And I was not aware that you were in that community during that time. I can't imagine what that was like for the community. But thank you for sharing your story. I wanted to lift up Maimonides and also Rav Kook for one thing that they share among many. Rav Kook, first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, so this is 1800s, and Maimonides, who is not Ashkenazi, right? He is Sephardi and lives a bunch of his time in Egypt, and is the physician to Salah ad-Din's court, to Salah ad-Din's person and Salah ad-Din's harem. So he is much trusted and is also going back and forth between sort of a lot of the imperial court setting at his time, and also the Jewish people he serves, who are not there. Maimonides, of course, is 12th century. One of the things they share that I find so beautiful is the high regard in which they hold regular people. There can be in certain Jewish religious writings a preference for Torah scholars and for people who devote their entire lives to Torah. And although people hold up great examples of late in life Jewish learning, of earning a Jewish living, earning a living while learning Torah, I mean, we don't know anything about what a heroic shepherd Akiva was before he became a rabbi, nor do we get to hear about Hillel's day job. And there's one, right? Rabbi Yosef the sandal maker that sort of sits with him. Maimonides has this tremendous respect for regular people, for shopkeepers, and for artisans, manufacturers. I mean, we're talking about people who get up every day, work from sunup to sundown, and He never comes out and says, like, blessed are the tiny people who have small jobs, right? And he isn't out there doing a populist rallying cry, right? Like, he's really bouncing back and forth between humbly serving the community and humbly serving the community by serving non-Jewish aristocracy. If you read the Mishnah Torah, his collection of Jewish law, what's his purpose in writing a complete legal code with everything you need to know to be Jewish successfully? Every practice, every ritual, every minute detail, right? Why does he do it? Because regular people have jobs. They don't have time for Talmud study. And at his time in history, either you grew up steeped in Talmud study or you didn't. And if you didn't, like, so I need an answer to a question about this bread, you're not going to get it, right? You either find somebody who will tell you, or they're like, here's a stack of Gemara you need to learn, and if you don't learn it, or that there was something wrong with a person who didn't spend enough time learning Torah, as though their other alternative were idleness. And Maimonides is saying, like, that's not the case. You know, these are people who are far from idle and don't have time for learning Torah and don't have time to become Talmud scholars, even if they are learning it. So what they need is they need a Hebrew Bible, they need a Tanakh, and they need the Mishnah Torah, right? The Mishnah Torah, the appendix to the Torah. You need this. He says in his introduction, you need a Tanakh and you need my book, Maimonides' book, the Mishnah Torah, which is not a book, it's pretty big. To tell the details, so that if you're wondering, is this chicken kosher? You have an answer, right? I forgot to add the Hanukkah paragraph in the Amidah. Do I have to repeat the Amidah? You can look that up. It is within your grasp if you speak basic Hebrew. And the way he talks about people who have to get up before the sun and have to daven early because they're going on a long trip, or they have to travel for work, or because they have to be involved in their job, goes to great lengths to define, like, if you're in the middle of certain kinds of manufacturing, like tanning leather or dyeing wool, you aren't supposed to stop, even if it means you're going to miss the Mincha Amidah, even if it means you're going to miss the service of Mincha. You don't stop. Goes to great lengths to define these things. And I think the whole of the Mishnah Torah is steeped in a deep respect for regular people and for people who are not privileged in a monarchy setting, who are never going to be close to the seat of power. Rav Kook is the greatest lover of farmers in the world, who has this overflowing, like, Hasidic love, right, this beaming out of him for farmers, who has a series of Talmud published with a 1 or 2 sentence summary at the bottom, so that maybe, because you don't have time, there are sheep in the morning and sheep in the evening, and everything else you do as a farmer in the middle, you don't have time for Talmud study. But yet you should not be distanced from the deep love of Talmud study, because it's a deep, beautiful thing. So therefore, the Talmud he has printed, and it's still in publication today, has a summary at the bottom of the couple of things you're supposed to have gotten from this page of Talmud. And even if that's the only thing you ever do, you got that. And then you can be said to be learning a page of Talmud a day, because you're on the Daf Yomi cycle. But you have a farmer-appropriate level of Torah study because, I mean, he would say, you are serving God and the Jewish people by feeding the country of Israel. There is no greater holy thing that you could be doing except possibly, you know, stopping someone from bleeding, giving them life-saving medical attention. He's just overwhelmed with love of farmers. I think that preferencing the needs of regular people is a really important thing. And that when we think about the monarchy, one of the things we have to think about is, how is that going to serve regular people? And how are regular people's voices going to be respected? because the Torah seems to think that it's absolutely not acceptable to exploit regular people, and that it's not okay, certainly in the more colorful parts of the Tanakh, as Rabbi Weiss alluded to, there are a lot of monarchs who do a lot of things that are bad to regular people, in addition to the ritual problems of, idolatry, for example. I think it also goes back to a tie-in to the Talmud of making sure that even when you are outvoted, your voice is still heard and is still repeated, even if that's not what everybody agrees to. And how we have respect for people who are not in a position of power or whose opinion is not agreed with. And it's a very delicate balance to uphold in a democracy. And in a monarchy, it's incredibly difficult. So if we are to continue those beautiful Jewish ideas of valuing the thoughts of regular people, of valuing diversity of thought and diversity of ideas, and how we honor everybody's ideas going forward, there are therefore people who say Judaism doesn't go rah-rah democracy, but Judaism and its pluralism and its love for regular people really does lean in that direction in certain ways. And with that, I think, Rabbi Weiss, do we have time to open it up for discussion, or?
Yeah, I think maybe what we'll do, if it's okay with everybody, is we'll open up for some questions, comments. First of all, thank you. Yasher Kochech. I want to just do virtual jazz hands for Rabbi Jacobson. It is such a pleasure to learn your Torah. And on a selfish level, I'm so happy you're here. So I want to look around the Zoom room and see if anybody wants to share some thoughts, reactions, questions, things that sparked. Let's see here. See, Doug has a comment. Let's see. I think Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else. Touche. Let's see. It looks like Don has a yes, Don.
Okay, so all of this is referring to Mashiach as a singular human being who is a monarch. So there's a lot of, Rabbi Jacobson and I have discussed this repeatedly, there's a lot of people who believe that Mashiach isn't supposed to be taken as a, in fact, person, more as motivation to make the world better. So, and honestly, I have very little trust for monarchies anyway, simply because of what I know historically. And I'm a good American, what can I say? But how does that jive with all of this if we're not even supposed to take it literally?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, thanks, Don. Thanks for saying that to someone other than just me, right? And I think you'll find that more often in the Reform movement, people will say that the Messiah is a messianic era rather than a messianic figure. And I think that, again, when we speak in English, right, we have to share our words. So for those of us who are waiting for a person rather than an era, we're actually also not waiting for a person. It's waiting for a person who begins a system. So, like Saul was great, David was great, Solomon was great. Then the kingdom divided. Then they started having problems, and then suddenly a couple generations later, and there's a golden calf in Beit El again. So. It's whether it's a person who begins a monarchy or that's beginning an era. Also, there are many Jews who don't like the idea so much that what they are waiting for is a messianic era of peace and not a messianic era of monarchy.
Great, thank you so much, Don. Let's see, it looks like Lou has a question. Let me ask. Here we go.
Just to share, in the Israeli foreign ministry, the joke was always because of the respect for Christian evangelicals who said, when the Messiah comes, we'll ask him if it's the first or second time.
Well said. Let's see. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Let's see. Thought I saw a hand. Let's see. All right, Ray. Go for it. Ray, do you
Oh, what?
here we go. Oh, asked on mute.
Just I come from an interfaith family, and so a lot of what I was exposed to growing up is some of the is Catholicism. And for me growing up, it was always interesting to see how American Catholics compared to European Catholics and East Asian Catholics and South American Catholics just kind of all, had their different jives with how their Pope, gives decisions and makes decisions, who gets voted. So, for me and learning about and growing in my Jewish heritage from my father's side, I just in the past few holidays I've been able to participate in, it's been interesting how Ashkenazi Jews approach, let's say, for instance, Passover differently than Sephardic Jews, and seeing how Mizrahi Jews approach that differently. The Messianic era, just the concept, I wonder how it would differ from us, being American Jews, how that differs from how South American Jews would view it versus how Kaifeng Jews in China view it, especially with Kaifeng Jews having had a monarch more recently than the rest of us.
It's a really interesting perspective, Ray. And I think absolutely, if you look at different writings on Messianism, like even within Judaism, they are very much informed by the time and place of the community that's imagining and dreaming of that. It's really a reflection of a kind of collective aspiration towards whatever value or maybe lack, the community is experiencing at that time. So in other words, communities that have been really down on their luck, there's been a kind of fervor. And I mentioned before, kind of around different millennial peaks, there tends to be an upswelling of messianistic fervor. So I definitely think both geography and time play a major role in how we think about Messiah. So it's not a monolith. When we talk about Messiah, it certainly is not like one kind of Jewish Messiah. In fact, the literature that we have about both Messianism, end of days, resurrection, right? It's incredibly complicated, and it is absolutely all over the place, which makes it so interesting. And that's part of what I think piqued our interest in this topic, is like, we're talking about messianism, but like there are so many different kinds of messianisms in a way. So it's a really interesting topic, and I thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, absolutely. I see that Doug has his hand. Yeah, Doug.
Yeah, so it's been a few weeks since I studied this part of the Torah, and I don't have the best memory, but I think it said God gets to appoint the king, and then I don't remember it saying anything about it being a that the descendants of the king are the ones who have to reign. Was that read in maybe later? And then the final kind of point is just that why couldn't we elect a king in some way that would be democratic but still Jewish? For whomever.
Yeah, yes, please. I'd love that. I'd get behind that. Look, I'd also get behind direct divine oversight, right? I mean, if God is teaching us to swim and is standing in the middle of the pool going, swim to me, and then stepping backwards, right, to make us reach and go further, so is God giving us a king and stepping back and then saying, all right, you deal with it? Or, because it's never the first one, right? We always agree with the first one. It's the ones after that that get problematic. Saul, or David, Solomon. Then it started getting complicated, and then, But I love the idea of electing a king and or having a, you know, new divine pronouncement every year.
Cool.
Sold. We've resolved that issue. Thank you so much. And then let's see, it looks like Jeff has his hand up as well. Let's see, ask me. Oh.
So, yeah, so my more like a comment is, after doing a study session with the youth this past year on the past election, I would say actually this time is really optimal for a monarch. I would say based on, you know, Pew studies and other things, I'd say we're kind of at that point where we're ready to abdicate to a single individual, and that's including you know, voting interest amongst Jews, especially amongst Orthodox Jews in particular. Just kind of the way things align, that they, so looking at international politics and looking at the way things have gone in the past, you know, 10 years, you know, go back long before just this previous election, I would say in general, we're headed in that direction where I think people are willing to accept. And it kind of reminds me of growing up. I think my parents wanted my rabbi, our rabbi, to be the Jewish person for us. You know, you practice Judaism for us, we'll practice life. So I kind of, that's kind of where I'd say we're, you know, I don't know that that's an answer, and it's certainly not from a biblical side, but I'd say from a sociological side, I'm kind of wondering where everybody else thinks we're at with this.
What do others think? Do we think we're ready for a monarch? Let's see, Donna has a.
I'll try not to talk too much. First off, the monarch was only granted as a sort of begrudging, oh, fine, because they didn't want to do the judges thing. I'm actually more comfortable with the judges thing, at least with my limited understanding, because the people at least trusted this person. With a hereditary monarch, that can end poorly if the son doesn't, if, you know, the son was a bit of a spoiled brat. So there's that. It's happened. And honestly, power being centered in one person, again, that's really, really hard for me to wrap my head around being a good thing, because yeah, it's easier for this one person to just tell us all what to do, but how just is that going to be? Like, that's, maybe I'm just being a good American again, but that's scary to me, because what if this person hated his mother and now all of us moms are in trouble? I mean, I got a lot of misgivings about that.
Misogyny and monarchy definitely went hand in hand. So you have just a foundation for those concerns. Let's see. I think let's see, Ruth and then Ray. There we go.
Oh, okay, I'm not muted. You know, I'm just wondering if having a monarch isn't just one additional step to God. I kind of like that in Judaism, or certainly as in conservative Judaism, it's us to God, God to us. Whereas inserting a monarch kind of in between, should I say, reminds me a little more of Christianity, you know, where you have Jesus in the picture. And I guess not that that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to, I don't want to get into, any kind of religious war here. But again, going back to what I said at first, I prefer the notion of, partly because I just think it's more simple and direct if it's us to God and God to us, with, no intervening body. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ruth. So like having just a more direct.
More direct, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, and then there's unmute Ray. There we go.
I guess when I'm thinking about it, it makes me think, especially of course this comes from a more secular standpoint, but I look at other nations around the world who have somehow melded the concept of their monarchy along with the people's voice. We have the parliamentary democracies, or sorry, parliamentary monarchies, like probably Ethiopia isn't the greatest example for Jewish representation, but just in the senses where the countries that still have their their family, their dynasty or family-based monarchies, but also they have a parliament or they have some other government. And what I think of the state of Israel, it's something that has been to appreciate those who feel more kin to their ethnicity as Jews versus being conservative Orthodox Jews who are constantly practicing this, I guess, even a slightly American idea of the separation of church and state, but in the sense of we would have the leaders, like our religious leaders, of the Rabbanut handling the things of which ways, the practicing Jews are, they're safe in a sense, like they're safe to walk about and do things and know that they're not going to, accidentally do something or eat something that is kashrut, versus those who are maybe not as observant, are still following, the Torah law, but without, I don't know, maybe they don't do their prayers 4 times a day. And they're just like, all right, I went to shul on Saturday, and that's it. I participate in the main holidays, and that's my practice. Versus it was like, okay, I woke up for Shema, I'm doing my Mishkaret, I'm doing my minyan at the end of the day and doing my Shema before I go to sleep. I imagine that would be a good idea, where you have, those who are studied in the law itself, those who are studied in our religious practices, and we're able to combine both without, different edges of the spectrum feeling constricted by the other.
I definitely think that would be the ideal, and I think it's so hard. I mean, I just as a reflection from my time living in Israel, there are certainly places in Israel where, finding kosher food is as hard as it is to find in Oklahoma. It's it's a very delicate balance, and when you know I think when we look at Israel as Jewish Disneyland, that can be dangerous, right? Like a place where we can go where everybody is happy all the time and Judaism is at its ideal. That can be very challenging because that's not everybody's experience of Israel, no matter what is going on, right? It's not, one policy or another is always affecting somebody negatively. And um, being able to respect people's choices when they're very near and dear to our hearts and we made a different choice than they did. I always view that as much harder than, I have 2 best friends, a Jewish best friend and a non-Jewish best friend. My non-Jewish best friend is much more respectful of Kashrut and Shabbat than my Jewish best friend is, because she made the same choices I did differently. And my non-Jewish best friend is just like, I have a separate pot for you when you come to my house because I have to make you this, and so I have a separate pot. And I made jam in a new pot because I was giving it to you. And my Jewish best friend is like, there's salad. You'll be fine with that. I also want to call back to something that was said a few minutes ago in 1 Samuel, when the prophet Samuel is letting God know that the people want a king. And Adonai said to Samuel, heed everything the people say, because it is not you they reject, Samuel, but me, God, as their king. They are not rejecting Samuel as their king, they are rejecting God as their king. And the idea that God is the ultimate king, the king of kings, and that an earthly king means some kind of challenge to that. That is where people look at the Tanakh and say, maybe Judaism isn't so hugely into monarchy the way we think about it. Just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, all these roles are kind of concessions. Like even the role of the judge on some level, which again, I think someone already said this here, that I feel more sympathetic to the role of the judge. In the Book of Judges, the actual titled Book of Judges, none of the characters who are portrayed as judges are actually called, interestingly, judges in the book, except for arguably Devorah, the prophetess. That's a kind of a more ambiguous piece. But I think there's a kind of implication there that maybe God is the ultimate shofet, God is the ultimate judge, and that all the others are kind of these stand-ins. And so it goes back to this question of, well, how do we govern? How do we self-govern in the absence of this interventionalist God, or this kind of model of obvious black and white, this is how it is? Just the inherent messiness of what it means to self-govern as Jews. And thank God we have this opportunity today to do so. But it's an ongoing experiment, and one that we're going to always have to exercise some degree of trial and error as we navigate it. Let's see. I also want to lift up a comment from the chat from Hannah, who was talking about a kind of Bundist perspective of what Messiah could look like as a kind of humanist, in other words, declaring our own agency. She writes that the workers themselves are this kind of redemptive force. And that absolutely comes in the welling up of all these moments, right? I mean, Marx is writing in the late 19th century, kind of approaching that, again, very important turn in history, when you have, at the same time, Jewish writers also aspiring towards some kind of deus ex machina, or maybe literal interventionalist. So it's really interesting how each group takes its dreams and holds it up as the ideal. Absolutely. Any other questions, comments? Let's see. And or local recommendation of where you live, because this journey has only begun. I'm just scanning the room. Well, unless there are any other final questions or comments or thoughts, I want to just thank so much all of you folks for coming here today. I want to thank Liz for introducing us, our president. I want to thank Helene, our adult ed chair, who was incredible. And I want to thank Rabbi Jacobson and her community for visiting us. And I want to thank all of our Beth-Ellers. And I want to thank Kara and Jeff for their presentations. This has been such an enlightening and an illuminating trip. A trip without any mileage, any carbon footprint, almost at all. There's a minimal one from our computers, but it is a more environmentally friendly way of saying hello. And God willing, we'll be able to one day say hello in person as well. I would love that for happy occasions. So please keep the conversation open. I'm going to actually throw in the chat my personal email. If anyone else wants to do the same, just to be in touch, because our arms and our doors are always open in Yardley. And we'd love to host you for real if you ever want to come visit. And just want to say a huge yasher koach to everyone here for your beautiful questions and comments, and say thank you so much. And want to say Shavua Tov. Wish everyone a blessed week.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Bethel, for having us. Putting my email up as well in case you're driving through. We get more people who are driving through to California. And when you do, be sure to look up Shalom Aleichem oil fields. Because,
and the zoo. And the zoo.
No, look up the zoo and go to the memorial at night and many of the things. But as you're driving in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, Shalom Aleichem oil fields.
Nice. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.